Hello and welcome. In this video, I will introduce you to some JavaScript data types. In programming in general and also in JavaScript, the data type basically refers to the classification that specifies the type of value that a variable has or stores. There are different types of data types in JavaScript. Here's a basic table with some basic JavaScript data types. So I'm going to start with the top one, which is a string. A string basically is a sequence of text that must be enclosed in quotes. You can use either single quotes or double quotes, but you cannot mix the quotes. For example, here you can declare a variable called myData and set it to this value. You can see I've got quotes around it. I've got my web console open. So the way to access your web console, if you are on a Windows computer, open up just Google homepage and type in Ctrl, Shift and J on your keyboard or F12, and that will give you access to the web console. If you are on a Mac, you do Command, Shift and J. That will give you access to the console. So let's create a simple variable that will store a string data type. So in my console, I'm going to create a new variable by typing in the keyword var, and I'm going to call this variable my colors. Okay, and I'm going to give it a value. I'm going to give this value of red. So that's the value. You can see I've enclosed the value in quotes, which means it's a string data type. The computer will recognize that as a string data type. So if I want to reference this variable, all I need to do is call it by its name, and it will just return the value red. So that's a simple example of how a string data type can be used. The next data type I want to mention is the number data type. Basically, it refers to any numerical value, and it does not need to have a quote around its value. So let me illustrate by creating a simple variable that will store a number data type. So I'll declare a simple variable by typing in the keyword var, and I'll call this variable door number, and I'll give it a value of 7. So this is known as a number data type. You can see it doesn't need quotes around it. So if I want to reference that variable, I just call it by its name, number, and it will return a value of 7. The next data type I want to mention is called a Boolean. A Boolean basically represents two values. One can be true, the other can be false. And when you're using Boolean values, no quotes required. To illustrate a Boolean value, I'm just going to compare two values. I'm going to say 4 is greater than 3. That will return true. And if I say 3 is greater than 4, and that will return false. So that's basically how Boolean value data types work. The next data type I want to mention is called an array. An array is a data structure that stores multiple values as one single reference. Basically, what that means, a variable can store only one value, but with an array, you can store multiple values as one single reference. You can see here, I've got two values here, Ford and Toyota, but I'm referencing it under one variable called my cars. So let me show you a quick illustration inside the console. So I'm going to declare a variable called my cars, and I'm going to set it to equals 2. And this is how you declare an array with square brackets, and inside the square brackets is where you place the values. So let's say the first value, I say it's a Ford, and second value I say is a Toyota. When you are using arrays, you separate each of the values with a comma, but the only where you don't need a comma is the very last value. So this basically here is an array, and the way you access the values in an array is via their index. So the way an array is referenced is by their index. So this will be known as a 0 index. This will be 1. If you have several, you can have as many as possible inside the square brackets, but you need to separate the values with a comma. And if they are of a string data type, you enclose it in quotes. If they are not, then you don't need to enclose it in quotes. Say for example, if I wanted to access value number 1, this is 0, index 0, which is Ford. All I need to do is type in my cars, and in lowercase, type in my cars, and then in square brackets I type in value 0, which will represent the index I'm trying to target, and that should return, you can see it has returned Ford. So that's how you, if I had like 20 inside here, I will reference it via the index based number. So Ford, the very first value is a 0 index, Toyota will be index number 1, and so on. So that's how you access the values in an array. So the key difference between an array and variable is that an array can store multiple values as one value. If you see here, I just got this variable called my colors, and it's only stored one value. Here I've got a variable called my cars, and it stores multiple values but referenced as a single value called my cars. The next data type I want to quickly mention is called the object. Everything in JavaScript is basically an object. So all the examples I've shown so far, they are basically objects. You can also represent JavaScript objects with curly braces, as I've done here. I've declared a variable called person and set the value to equals to the first name, got John, last name, Doe. So you can represent an object like this way as well, but by using curly braces. So if I wanted to access this object here, all I need to do is call the variable by its name, and it will return you can see it's returned the first name as John, last name as Doe. Another data type I want to introduce you to is called null. You may come across this in your learning with JavaScript, and basically a null data type is something that does not exist. You can also use the null data type to empty the value of a variable, and a null is also an object data type. So you can see here I've got a variable here called door number and with a value of 7. So I can empty that value by just typing in the name of the variable, which is dot number, and setting the value to null, and that will empty the current data it stores. So if I call this variable called door number now, it will come back saying null because I've emptied out the whatever it was storing. Okay, so a null data type means basically nothing. It doesn't store anything. There's nothing in there. The final data type I want to talk about is called undefined. Undefined is similar to null. The only difference is that they are different data type. Undefined is undefined, while a null data type is also an object data type. So if you declare a variable and you don't give it a value, that will become undefined. For example, if I come here and say variable sweets and I don't give it any value, that will become undefined. If I try to call it by its name, it will come back undefined. So that's the key difference. The key difference between a null and undefined is that undefined is not an object data type, while null is an object data type. So that's basically it for this video on JavaScript data types. Thanks for watching and bye for now. Hello and welcome. In this video, I'll be showing you some basic examples of how you can mix data types. When you are creating certain variables or objects in JavaScript, you can mix the data type. For example, in an array, you can have an array that contains a string and also a number. So let me create a very basic variable. I'm going to create a variable and I'm going to call this variable x. I'm going to give it a value which is going to be an array. You can tell it's an array because I'm using square brackets, and I'm going to give the first value in the array. I'm going to make that a string. I'm going to call that John. So you separate each value in an array with a comma, and I'm going to make the second value in the array a number. So here I've created a basic object which is an array that has two values, which is also known as the length. So the length of this array is 2. So if I press enter, it comes undefined because I've not referenced it. So if I want to reference it, I just call it by its name, which is x, and press enter. So it tells me here that this is an array and it has two values, or length 2. And it tells you here the values, John and 0. So if I expand this now, you can see an array basically is referenced by the index. So the very first value will be index 0 and the second value with it will be index 1. So if I wanted to access, for example, this value called 7, I'll have to reference it by this index 1. And it tells you a length. That means the length of the array is 2. It's got two values. So you can see it's possible to mix data types. So I've mixed a string and a number data type inside an array object. When mixing data types, you also have to be careful because it can lead to some unexpected results. For example, when you are performing calculation, so you got to be careful not to mix a string value and a number value. So let me illustrate. So let's say I create a variable a and give it a value of, say, 7 plus 7. All right, and I create another variable. I'll call this variable b, and I'll give this a value of 7 plus 7. So I've got two variables now. If I call variable a will return a value of 14, which is 7 plus 7. If I call variable b, it will return a value of 77 because the first value is a string, so it uses this plus sign to concatenate or add the 7 to the string. So if I call the variable b now, it will return 77. So you got to be careful when you're doing calculations so as not to mix a string and a number if you don't want unexpected result. It's okay if you're expecting the values that gets returned, but if you're not expecting it, then you need to be cautious when you are mixing a number, for example, and a string. If I, for example, create another variable here, I'll call this variable c, and I'll set that to equals to, say, a string, and I'll call this hello, and I'll concatenate this. I'll add a number 7. Now if I call this variable c, I expect it to return hello 7. Alright, so that's basically how you mix variable, but you gotta be careful when you're doing calculations so you don't get unexpected results. So that's basically it for this video. Thank you for watching, and bye for now.